I hate losing things. In fact, it's one of the things that I pride myself on is that I don't lose stuff. I don't lose my keys, like ever. So when people lose their keys, I'm like, I'm sorry that happened to you. Can't relate. Because I just don't lose stuff. I hate losing things. And so the other day, my daughter and I, we went to a football game, and she started asking me for candy. Because they have figured out how to take all your money at these high school football games. They just have burgers, just billowing, just delicious smelling, smells, and then they have all the candy. And my daughter's just like, Daddy, please, can I just have Skittles? And so, because I'm a good dad, I looked at her right in the face and I said, there's no way. But my daughter has some of these traits that you kind of really glad that they're going to have someday. They're really annoying now, but you love that they have them. They're going to make for a very successful adult, but right now it's kind of oh man, really? And one of those things is that she can really argue her case. At some point, she's probably going to be a lawyer. She's just kept on coming up with reasons why I should buy her candy. And so I was like, okay, finally, just stopped all of it. I was like, all right, let's go get some candy. So we walked up to the concessions and I opened up my wallet and I looked for my debit card and it was not there. Have you ever had that moment where you're just like, where is it? I don't know where it is. And being somebody who always prides himself on never forgetting things, I was horrified. I was like, I don't even remember the last time I used that thing. It's just gone. And I blame Apple Pay because I use that all the time, just use my phone all the time, right? And so I didn't even remember the last time I'd used my debit card, but it was just gone. So I started immediately blaming children. I was like, did you steal it? Because obviously I don't forget stuff. Where is it? And I went online to my app and I found out that the last time that thing had been swiped was at a place called El Paso, which is a Mexican place here in town. And I realized that my wife and I had gone on a date that Friday, and we were so interested in the conversation that when I paid, I just left the card there and walked out. And I forgot. And I believe a lot of us feel that God's done the same thing to us. There are other things that are more interesting. There are other things he has to do, and he's forgotten about us. We've been forgotten. And even though we may be feeling this pain or this hurt, or we're feeling this angst, or we're wondering if God's going to answer the prayer that we've been praying over and over again, we feel like he doesn't see us, and he doesn't care, and he's forgotten about us. Today, the people of God were feeling the same way. They were feeling that God had forgotten them, and we're going to see that God never forgets his promise. So, Exodus chapter 2, start in verse 1. Exodus 2, verse 1 says this. Now a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe in the Nile while her servant girls walked along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl, took it, opened it, and saw him, the child. And there he was, a little boy crying. She felt sorry for him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you?" "Go," the Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. And then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the boy and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, our story is tied to our very first week in the book of Exodus. The first week of Exodus, we talked about how God's people had moved to Egypt, and they'd moved there to escape a great famine. And when they got there, they were really just a small gathering, about 70 people, kind of maybe like your family at Christmas. Maybe your family's smaller than that. Maybe you get all the aunts and uncles, but this is a large extended family. They moved to Egypt, and then they grew to a great nation, numbering in the millions. Well, the Egyptians were very concerned about the fact that there was this other ethnic group living inside their borders. And so they took action. They enslaved them and made them to work building things and building cities. And part of the journey for the Egyptians is they're trying to figure out how to curb this population. Is they said, we're gonna begin to start doing population control. And it's horrific to even think about. But what they do is they start killing all the baby boys. And here you find a woman having a child, and she sees that he's beautiful, and she's not willing to give her son up. And so she decides to have him, and that little boy is Moses, the main character of this entire story. And about 3 months after he's born, she can't contain him anymore. As a dad of 4, I totally get it. There's a stage where you can't hide the children anymore, right? She's like, shh, be quiet, and they just keep doing their thing anyway. Some of you parents feel that way right now. You're like, you can't hide them. They're loud. And let me just tell you, if your kid is acting up here today, we're cool with it. We know what it's like. We get it. And you're not alone. We all, we're going to create a support group later for parents with kids that come to church, right? Because y'all are heroes. Anyway, so she can't really hide this baby anymore. So she comes up with a plan. Her plan is she's going to go build a little boat and stick him in it and then put him in the river, which is like the worst childcare idea ever, right? I mean, it's literally like, we're just going to put him in the river. And some of you think that that's her plan long term. And then the Pharaoh's daughter just kind of happens to spot him and rescues her from bad parenting decisions. But that's not what's happening. She's trying to engage Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter was a priestess. The entire family of the king believed that they were semi-divine, like they are the incarnation of their pantheon. And so part of her job was to lead worship services. And this part of this worship service was her going to the river to worship the river god, the Nile River. And so she's going to bathe there. Moses' mom says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to ambush her. We're going to put this baby in a boat, and we're going to bring it to her so she'll believe that her God brought the baby to her, and we're just going to hope that she has mercy on Moses. And so she sees the baby. She sees that he's crying. She has mercy on Moses and chooses to adopt him. And so Moses is adopted, and it's just something beautiful here in the text where you see that God uses adoption to accomplish his purposes. Sometimes God may bring a baby that no one else loves into a home, and he can change the destiny of an entire people, an entire nation. He can be a redemptive work that God can do. That's why we love adoption here at First Baptist, because God can redeem brokenness and broken stories, and adoption is one of the ways that he does that. And so you see this little boy being adopted, and he grows up in both homes because Pharaoh's daughter then says, I want him to be raised in his home, the home of his mother, and I'm then also going to adopt him. And so he grows up in the palace and in the hovel. He grows up in a place where there's probably just a dirt floor and they have nothing. But he learns about a God that has a plan for his people, and he knows that he's a Hebrew, but he's also a prince of Egypt. Our story continues in verse 11. It says, years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. And looking around, seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, why are you attacking your neighbor? Who made you commander and judge over us? The man replied. Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses became afraid and thought, what I did is certainly known. And when Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. So Moses grows up knowing that he's a Hebrew, and one day he goes to go visit his people, and he sees someone, maybe somebody knows, being beaten by an Egyptian. And so you find that Moses is someone who's hardwired for redemptive acts. He cares about justice and cares about the oppressed. And so he steps in and ends up killing the Egyptian and hides his body. And here you think Moses is like, okay, I think it's on. I think I've been raised up for such a time as this. I'm going to rise up and lead my people and do what God has always been wanting to do. I'm going to step into this moment. I'm going to be the liberator of God's people. But when he goes back, no one wants to follow him. He's like, I'm going to go this way. And everybody's like, you're on your own, buddy. We don't really follow you. And you find him coming to a place where he's afraid for his life because it gets out that he's killed this Egyptian. Now, the fact that he killed this man is probably not why Pharaoh wants to kill Moses. People who were nobility at that time could kill other people with no repercussions. It's not until the Magna Carta in England that normal people, ended up having rights. But the reason why Pharaoh wants to kill Moses is because Moses is not just a soft prince who lives in a palace. He's a warrior. There are accounts in Josephus' writings that Moses is like this kind of like Braveheart type figure. He was a general. He was a soldier. He won great conquests in Africa. And so he's not simply just a guy. He's someone who's a force to be reckoned with. And Pharaoh is afraid that Moses is going to use his people to become the next Pharaoh. And so Moses runs. And I think it's important for us to think about what happened there that day as he's beginning to run, in that God is teaching Moses something here, and he's teaching him something really important that you need to hear, is that God will act and God does see, he does remember, but he doesn't want us to go outside of his plan to accomplish his purposes. Because if you want to do God's will, you have to do it God's way. Moses had not been told by God to free the people. He saw that it was a need, but had not been called to do it. And even though it was right for him to want to liberate his people, that was not what God had called him to do. And as a result, he short-circuited God's plan for his life. Because if you want to please God, you have to do it his way. So I was working on my house yesterday, and I grew up in a family that was not very handy. My dad is like a great missionary, but does not fix things. And so I've always been like insecure about fixing stuff around the house until a couple years ago, my wife and I bought a fixer-upper. This thing was like in bad shape. When we walked through it, we were like, no way. I remember talking to Tabitha. She's like, never buying that house. It's just not gonna happen. Like, we just don't do that. And then we started watching the show Fixer Upper with Chip and Jo. And we accepted Chip and Jo in our heart and said, we can do this. And so we have been like remodeling the house that we lived in for the last like 10 years. And it's been like so life-giving. I feel so empowered and so manly because I can like actually wire electrical things now. And so I was doing that yesterday. I was working on our lights outside because none of them worked. And so I was just working on them. And as I was wiring it, I was reminded that when you wire a light, you can really only do it one way. Like, there's a lot of ways to do it wrong, but you can only do it right one way. And I discovered that as I spent, like, honestly, about an hour trying to wire these lights together, and then I walked back to the fuse box and I flipped the fuse, and it just went pop and short-circuited. I was like, oh no. So I went back out and rewired it again, flipped it, pop. And I did that for about another hour. I was like so frustrated. Finally, I got it right. Flipped on those lights and I was like, praise Jesus, called it a day. I like literally watched football the rest of the day. I couldn't do anything else. Why? Because I was like, I am tired of the short circuiting, right? I just can't do it anymore. And the same thing is true for our life. God has a plan and a purpose, and we may see lots of things that we want to change about our life. We may even see things that we want to change about the world. But if we don't do them God's way, it'll always short circuit. It may work for a moment, but eventually there's going to be a fire. And we're going to be in a place that we never thought we could be. And I could take 100 different examples of this. I'm just going to use relationships for just a minute. Every single person in this room wants to be loved. And no one wants to be lonely. Like, you might like to be alone every once in a while. You may just need to shut everybody out. But nobody wants to be alone. And part of that is that there is something that is not sinful that God said it isn't good. That is loneliness. When God created Adam, He said, it's not good for man to be alone. Sin hadn't even come into the world yet. God was like, yep, that's not good. So he created Eve. He's created us for relationship. God knows what relationship's like. He's constantly been in relationship, Father, Son, and Spirit, for eternity past and eternity present and eternity future. God knows that community is important. And yet, often when it comes to our own life and our loves, when we feel alone and we feel like we want to be in a relationship, we can choose the wrong person. We can choose Mr. Right now instead of Mr. Right. Why? Because we don't want to be alone. We can try to find a quick fix in pornography or other things. Why? Because we feel the weight of being alone. And God said, listen, I created you for a relationship. And if you trust me and you do things the way I've asked you to do it, where you honor one another, where you stay righteous and pure and holy in your relationships, when you honor me with your body and the way that you live your life, when you do that, I will honor it. So don't short circuit what's going on in your life. Why? Because if you could see what God has for you, if you could see what he has in store for you, you would agree with him. It's just that you don't see it right now. And Moses had no idea that God wanted to liberate his people, but he did not just want to liberate the people in Egypt. He didn't want to just liberate them in Egypt, where they would stay in Egypt. That wasn't good enough for God. God wanted to liberate his people out of Egypt. God said, I have given Abraham a land. It's not Egypt. It's Israel. And you can't accomplish my purpose here. You must go there. So anything less than that is not what I'm going to honor. And Moses fled. And he lands in a place called Midian. Look with me at verse 16. It says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then some shepherds arrived and drove them away, but Moses came to their rescue and watered their flock. And when they returned to their father Reuel, he asked, why have you come back so quickly today? They answered, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. So where is he? He asked his daughters. Why then did you leave this man behind? Invite him to eat dinner. Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. She gave birth to a son whom he named Gershom, for he said, I've been a resident alien in a foreign land. Moses is sitting by this well, and as he's there, he sees some women come. And those women become harassed by some other shepherds. So Moses becomes a ninja again, fights off these shepherds. The girl's like, yay! They leave. And Moses is like, I guess I'm going to hang out by this well a little bit longer. Eventually, he gets invited to dinner and gets married and settles in with this tribe. And I believe that he is at a point where he doesn't know what God is doing anymore, and he feels like God is abandoned. And the reason for that is the way that he names his son Gershom. Can you imagine being little Gershom, going up to his dad and going, hey, Dad, what does my name mean? Because names had a lot of significance back then. They do today. And my kids all have a name that has some kind of significance to it. So they'll ask me, like, why is my name this? And I'll tell them what their name means. But imagine little Gershom. Gershom's like, Dad, what does my name mean? And his dad looks at him with like just a solemn look and says, your name means you're an alien, because I'm an alien. Like, I've given up. But what you see is that even though Moses has come to a place where he feels that he's forgotten, God has not forgotten him, because the next thing that you see in verse 23 is that God finally acts. Verse 23, it says, after a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of the difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of difficult labor ascended to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and God knew. This is earth-shattering information for everybody who read this the first time, because they did not know that God saw them and that he knew. And God says, no, I saw, I knew. I heard. And one word I think is important for us to highlight. It's the word remember. In Hebrew, it's the word zakar, which does not mean that God's like, oh, totally forgot about that. Left the pot on the oven. Totally forgot. I need to go do that. That's not what that word means. What that word means is that God is about to act on his promise. See, God had made a promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that he would bless the entire world through God's people. And their descendants would fill the earth. You're part of that promise. And God remembered his promise. He said, it's time for me to act. And I think it's important for us and very instructive to understand that what God is doing in us is something that we often can't see. You see, Moses had no idea that God was about to act, so he tried to be a hero. He tried to do it on his own strength. But God was already acting. God was creating the man that Moses needed to be. We learned this with Joshua, with the book of Jonah. God had to work in Moses before he could work through Moses. God had to create something in Moses. He had already been building in him all the skills he needed to be the rescuer. He knew how to be a general. He knew how to be Egyptian royalty. He knew how to be a slave, but he did not know how to be a leader in the wilderness. For the next 40 years, he's going to be leading not just sheep through the wilderness, but he's going to be leading an entire nation. And guess what was really handy during those years? Where having the understanding where every water hole was, where every path was, where every place of quicksand was, Moses knew because he lived in the wilderness. God sent him to where he needed to be the leader that God could ultimately use. Because what God wanted to do was not raise up a leader. God wanted to be the one who got the credit. When God actually liberates the people, it's clear that it is God who did it and not Moses. And the same thing is true for you. I don't know what you're going through today. I don't know if you're like, man, I feel like something's being taken away from me. It's my joy, or it's my birthright. I feel like something is being just taken out of my life, and I'm just mad about it. God, do you not see me? Some of you feel like you've been praying for someone to get healthy or someone to come home, or you've been just feeling it's a burden for the nations, or you're feeling like just something heavy. And you're like, God, why are you not doing it right now? But God is doing something in you. And he's not wasting anything in your life right now. Even though you feel like you're wasting your time, he's going before you. He's preparing you for it. And you need to be somebody who responds by crying out to the Lord. That's your place. There's a man named Milton Friedman who's a leadership guru. And he talks about how healthy people and organizations lead in times of crisis. There's this little acrostic, the word hero. Can you say the word hero? Oh, come on. It's the end of the sermon. We can say that better, right? Hero. Okay. I almost put Enrique Iglesias' Hero song on at this point in the sermon, but I decided not to. Has restraint, okay? However, the word hero is important today because it's going to help us understand how to respond to moments of crisis. Milton Friedman put this in a fraction, put the HE on top and the R at the bottom. The HE stands for the hostility of the environment. Every single person has moments where we're in a hostile environment. That could be at work, where somebody's like giving you a hard time for being a Christian. It could be at home, where you're like, man, my kids are like absolutely crazy right now. It could be a moment where your spouse is dealing with a lot of difficulty and you don't know how to relate to them. And a lot of us, when we find a hostile environment, we try to control it, which brings anxiety. Like, man, this person's sick. I can't fix it. Man, this thing is too big. I can't overcome it. Man, I got too much debt. So we try to fix that. And we feel the emotional weight of it. We enter into it emotionally. But what we need to focus on is not the hostility of the environment. What we're supposed to focus on is the response of the organism. And the organism is any group of people. It could be one person. It could be an entire church. It could be a community. It could be a nation. And mature organizations and mature people focus on their response. How do you respond when life gets really, really tough? When your kid comes to you and they're facing bullying, do you go just tell that kid to go away and just lose your mind on their parents? No. What you do is you respond to the child that you have in front of you and you care for them. Because you can't control the environment. It's too big. Often it's way too big and too hostile. But you have the ability to respond, and your response is your responsibility. When you do that, anxiety just gets lifted off your shoulders because you can only follow God in what He's asked you to do and not change everything else. And when Moses finally understood that he didn't have to liberate the entire nation and take on Egypt by himself, that God could do that, all he had to do was follow him. That was the first moment that God was like, now I'm ready to act. And what you find in our very next chapter, what we'll look at next week, is that God shows up on the scene and reveals himself to Moses. And God wants to do the same thing for you. So I don't know where you are. You might feel forgotten. You might be wrestling with your relationship with God. You feel like you've forgotten. But your response in our time of 120 seconds is simply this. I invite you to pray this. Would you just say, God, would you remember me? You've promised you'd never abandon me. Would you remember me? The anxiety, the fear, the stress I'm carrying, God, it's all part of the hostile environment that I'm in. So I want to respond by saying, God, you can have this. In our time of 120 seconds, I want you to just do business with God. You can come up front, you can stay where you are, but simply just say, God, remember me. And as you do it, I know that God's going to meet us in this place. Let me pray. Jesus, God, I know that there's people in this room who some know you really well, others have had seasons in their life where they were really close to you, but right now it's not one of them. God, I pray that right now they would feel your presence, that they would know that they're not forgotten, abandoned, that you have a purpose and a plan for them. For those who are walking through the valley of the shadow, God, I pray that they would remember that you have not forgotten them, and that our cry, when it comes to you, you see, you hear, and you know. So give us a sense of your goodness and your presence today. It's in your name, Jesus.